Well, go ahead and have a seat. Welcome to Village Church. If this is your first time here, my name's Steve, one of the pastors here at Village Church, and as always, I'm thankful and grateful to see each and every one of you. If you have a Bible, go ahead and open it to Matthew chapter 22. We're going to be starting this morning in verse 34, but we've been going through for the past weeks, many weeks, Matthew 21 and 22, and these chapters cover a tense discourse between Jesus and the religious leaders. Started with the clearing of the temple, and then it comes to a conclusion this week as we discuss the Great Commandment to love God and love others. And then Matthew 23 that we'll get into next week shifts from a discourse to more of a monologue in which Jesus pronounces 7 woes on the religious leaders of Israel. But the crux of the discourse on these 2 chapters has ultimately been about the identity and authority of Jesus. These leaders had failed to recognize the rightful authority that Jesus had as the Son of God and the promised Messiah because their faith wasn't actually in God. Rather, their faith was rooted in their identity and in their own authority and the prestige that they enjoyed in the culture. The sinful problem is not that different in our age, as God is denied and even blasphemed by those that refuse to submit to Him and to the authority that He has over our lives because people want to be completely autonomous in the way that they view themselves. And the great tragedy and that myth of autonomy is that it is ultimately a fight between creation and the Creator, the one who has made every single one of us, and foolishly proclaiming some type of equality with God or even trying to subvert Him and show superiority over the God that created all that is. It is a foolish endeavor, and ultimately it ends with the wrath of God being poured on all that would not follow Him and submit to His reign. Jesus in verses 34 through 46 of this chapter is once again confronted by the religious leaders with a deceitful question. And it's really a question that's trying to seal the deal, to arrest Jesus, to execute Him. But Jesus' response is fascinating because in it He claims to summarize the entire law of God. As I said before, this section is rightly referred to as the Great Commandment. And that designation is vital because it is often taken out of context, even as it is called the Great Commandment. And today what I hope to do is to kind of look at the size and the scope of this commandment, but also to reveal the narrow application that Jesus gives that is completely wrapped up in having to trust Him and follow Him to even know what love actually is. So jumping right into it this morning, number one, love is defined by God. Love is defined by God. In Luke 22:34, here's where we are. But when the Pharisees heard that He had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. These guys cannot learn a lesson. They keep trying and failing, and they're going to try one more time. Verse 35, and one of them, a lawyer, asked Him a question to test Him. Teacher, what is the great commandment in the law? Verse 37, and Jesus said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And then Jesus gives them a bonus round, verse 39, and a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commandments depend all of the law and prophets. And so if you ask people, even non-Christians, what is the greatest commandment? More often than not, you will get some version of what Jesus says right here. Now, usually it won't be the same thing Jesus says. It will be a gross misinterpretation of what Jesus says. But if you ask somebody, what's the great commandment? So they might say, love is the great commandment. Or somebody, if you ask them what the great commandment is, they might respond and say, oh, loving other people is the great commandment. If you say, what's the great commandment? They're going to look at you and say, oh, the great commandment is you have to love God and love other people. But then the most important question is not what's the great commandment. The most important question, what Jesus deals with here, is what is love? And that is usually where our problem comes into place because So often we want to treat love as a subjective issue rather than an objective issue. We want to be able to define love by whatever seems to come natural to us. We want to treat love as though it is a feeling. We want to treat love as though we have some type of autonomous authority to define what love is. And usually, even if we say the Great Commandment is to love God and love others, it is then often turned into a weapon to talk about how other people are failing to live up to that standard because you are not loving me properly. Don't you know you're supposed to love me as you love yourself? And so love then just becomes a selfish, subjective reality that you own, that you define, that meets your needs, and we miss the entirety of what Jesus is talking about altogether. And that shouldn't surprise you, but it should give you a determination to understand love so that you can make better disciples. It's vital that we interpret what Jesus states within the context of what he is actually saying and then look at all the verses around it. Because what we usually do is, when we're talking about the Great Commandment, we just kind of carve around the Great Commandment and we ignore everything that's around it. And we shouldn't do that. We should look at everything that's going into what Jesus is saying, because in misinterpreting the call that Jesus gives us to love, we are left without the tools to actually understand what he's talking about to begin with. And often we simply do not want to change our preconceived notions of what we want love to be. But in this text, Jesus gives us an objective definition to love that is rooted in the arc of Scripture as a whole. I want you to note that Jesus does not give a new commandment in this. Oftentimes people say, oh my goodness, so he's kind of divorcing himself or unhitching himself from the Old Testament and everything that the Old Testament said, and he's telling us, you just simply need to live a life of love, and that's what it's all about. And so we can forget everything that's behind. This is a new commandment, but that's not what's going on at all. Love is not subjective. Rather, what Jesus is doing is he's summarizing the Old Testament. In Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5, Jesus almost verbatim quotes this text. It says, you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your might. And so what's he's saying? He's saying everything that you are and everything that you have needs to be pointed to God. It needs to be given to God. You need to live your life for God. And it comes after what Jews would consider there, John 3:16, Deuteronomy 6:4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. And so it's not even subjective in the sense of what do you think God is. It comes directly after the identity of who God is to say your love must be bound up in who he is. But the second isn't something that Jesus introduces to them. Rather, this is something also rooted in the Old Testament. Leviticus 19:18. It says, you shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall what? Love your neighbor as yourself. And so if you stop there, you also will miss it. Because then we can say, okay, so the God part, I have to love him. He gets to define that. But the love others part, well, I have to love them as myself. So how do I want to be loved? You don't even get to do that. You have zero authority over this too. How do I know that? How does he end the verse? Verse 18, he says, love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. He says, if you want to obey number 2, see number 1. He says, you have to love God to even know what it means to love other people, because love is bound up and defined by who God is. He's even specific enough in Leviticus 19:18 to use the proper name for God. When you see in your English translations, capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, that is the proper name for God, Yahweh. And so he's saying, you have to specifically root your love for other people in who God is. And that's vital for us to understand love. He's rooting the definition in the revealed law of God. It's not up to me. It's not up to you. If you want to have any hope of loving God, you have to look to God for how to do it. If you want to have any hope for how to love other people. You have to look to what God has revealed to us about himself in the law to be able to do that either. And that is vital for us to understand things like even the origin of life or even morality itself. Jesus is defining love as a moral activity. Therefore, it must come from an objective root in order to have any meaning whatsoever. The image of God that was put in you at creation is the reason that you have the capacity to love. That comes from God. The love, then, is rooted in the morality that God has revealed and that flows out of his being and into our lives. And so love, then, is not an end in and of itself. Love has an objective definition. It doesn't terminate on itself. Therefore, when you hear the phrase nowadays, love is love, that's a self-defeating phrase. It's all over my neighborhood. People have gone on Etsy, bought these little flags. It says in this house, and it says a host of things, but the very first one defeats everything else. Because when you start with misdefining love, you will not be able to fulfill any moral definition of love as itself. Why? Because the phrase love is self-defeating. It cannot live up to itself if it is just the definition of itself. It defeats itself. So what is love? Well, it's love. Well, then what's that? Love. And you just continue down a train of illogical realities until you arrive at the station of chaos. Love must be rooted in someone or something in order to be able to have a real outlet for itself. So to say love is love, giving me the autonomy, because that's the hope. Since love has been too exclusive and bigots exist, love has to be acceptable no matter how you define it. And so we're trying and making an attempt to open the doors so that we can be more inclusive. But when you open the doors to redefining what God has already defined, you are left in the end with absolute chaos. Because who are you then? Because here's the point. Who are you to tell me that my definition of love is lacking? Well, if that's the case, then I can put anything on love and it has to be acceptable. Therefore, if love is love, well, then I can say abuse is love. I can say making a victim of someone, that's love too. Anything under the sun can then therefore be love, which gives me the autonomy at the end of the day to say hate is love. So if anything is acceptable under the sun and there's no moral root, then you cannot arrive at any ultimate authoritative definition to disqualify any action, activity, feeling, or identity as being unloving. Because who are you to exclude any definition that I would give to love? Love is a completely self-defeating phrase. Therefore, what does the scripture tell us to do? Well, the Apostle John in 1 John 4:16, he says, so we have come to know and to believe that the love that God has for us. What is he saying there? It's in Jesus Christ. Love is perfectly revealed on the cross of Christ as he sacrificed himself for us. Then through the power of the resurrection, he's given it to us. The next three words are vital. God is love. And he continues, and whoever abides in love abides in God, and God abides in him. Important to note is that it doesn't say love is God. Because if love was God, then love would be the root of itself, and then God has to fall under submission of some, mythical, ethereal definition of love that doesn't exist. But instead, it says God is love. So who stands up over love according to John? God. So who defines love? God. Who limits love? God. Who puts a definition on what is loving and what is unloving? It must be God, or there is no such thing as morality as a whole. you are left with nothing but chaos and the ability to redefine and overdefine and underdefine love by any standard that an autonomous individual would put on top of it. It must be rooted in God. It depends on God. And without God being the definer, love is completely unknowable. That's the problem. Any definition of love that does not meet the standard of God's law, according to Jesus Christ, remember, root this in what Jesus himself said. According to Jesus, any definition of love that does not meet the standard of his law is what? Not love. And so if you want to know what love is according to Jesus Christ, not a new commandment, he says, you already know this, he's saying to Israel. Look backwards, look to Deuteronomy, look to Leviticus, look at what God has revealed in his love. You do not have the authority to pick and choose amongst a mountain of definitions what you want love to be. If you want the real, the genuine, the real thing, look to God's law. Secondly, real love requires the commitment of mind and will. Real love requires the commitment of mind and will. Our world is enamored with what I want to refer to today as anti-love. And this comes from an anti-version of God. There is no way to redefine love without leading people away from God. And that's why it's important to understand that God's definition of love is rooted in God's understanding of morality. So if I were to go to your house today and steal something, that would be wrong, right? If it belongs to you, I take it. That is wrong. That is sin. A penalty needs to happen for that. I need to pay you back with interest according to God's law. You're probably going to call the police. Like there's going to be a penalty paid. That is simple sin. That is simple evil. I've defied God's law. I'm held accountable to God's law. It is another thing completely to then redefine the law to try to avoid the penalty of God's law falling on me. To which you might say, oh, Steve, no, you don't understand. Sin is sin. God sees all sin as equal. I want to challenge you for a moment in understanding that. All sin is offensive to God, but not all sin is equal. How do I know that? Because I would rather you steal my truck than kill my child. And I hope if you're not a monster, you would hope the same thing. Though the reactions that I would have to those two things would be bad, but one would be far worse. I love my truck, right? Just kidding. You'll get that in a minute if you think about it. No, murder is worse than stealing. Therefore, if you look to God's law, the penalty for stealing is far less consequential than the penalty for murder. One has capital punishment. One, I need to repay you with interest according to God's law. So even the penalty that God's law gives shows us it's not all actually equal. If it has a different penalty under it, one is worse than the other. But when you seek to redefine what God has defined as being the basis that society has built in general, then you move into a cosmic evil. You move into what is referred to as a cosmological evil because you've now moved into the field of blasphemy. Therefore, if God limits the rails of love, he puts borders around it, which he has, and I'll point that out in just a moment. But if he puts borders around what is loving and what is unloving, and you do that which is unloving, well, then you have sinned against God. But it is another step then to go into the area that is unloving and then look to it and say, no, there's no penalty for what I'm doing. Why? Because God's law is not the limit of love. Love is love. Man on man, woman on woman, man becomes woman becomes man. Everything is up for grabs once you go over into the area of anti-God and begin to consume what is anti-love. And the reason that that is a greater evil, because that is not just an evil that affects you, that is an evil that depends on you making disciples of the anti-God, changing society at large to accept what you want to define as love in opposition to what God has defined in love. So not only are you going against God, but you are looking behind you and saying, come, I will lead you to the inclusive promised land. Therefore, love is the new ethic upon which a new society is built away from God. And that's why it must be opposed. Therefore, anything outside of the realm of God's law for love is a sin against creation itself. It is a blasphemy against God. It's not just breaking God's law, it's an attempt to rewrite God's law at large and call what God says is sin good. When you seek to redefine the standards of God's law, you are blasphemous, and it is a heinous, heinous evil. Therefore, when you hear me or when you hear someone else use harsh rhetoric, what you would label as harsh, against things like homosexuality, against gender confusion, against any type of sexual fluidity, the question then must become, where does it stop? To which you would have to appeal to some form of morality. But remember, we can't do that anymore. We've divorced ourselves from God's morality, created a new reality. And the fact is, it doesn't. It can't. It's been 5 years since the Obergefell decision in the Supreme Court where gay marriage was made legal. The statement when gay marriage was made legal is it won't have further ramifications. It won't affect you. It won't affect your marriage. It won't affect your family. It won't affect any institution under the sun. What quickly happened? Man marries man. Woman marries woman. Man can now become woman. Woman can now become man. You can become anything under the sun. And what's being discussed now? Man can be with child. When you remove God's law from being the limiting factor in soul and society, you can expect radical evil to overwhelm and begin to consume soul and society. And what's vital to what Jesus is saying here is he looks at it, he says God's law has ultimately two standards. Now, if you read the Old Testament, you're going to find there aren't just two of them. There's a whole lot of laws in the Old Testament. But just take the 10 Commandments. Some of you didn't know there were more than 10. Charlton Heston wasn't telling you the whole law of God, okay? There were more, all right? But just take the 10 Commandments as the limiting factor and say, how does what Jesus is saying here apply to the 10 Commandments? Is he replacing them? No, he's summarizing them. The first 4 of the 10 Commandments are about your relationship with God. The final 6 of the 10 Commandments are about your relationship with other people. You will find, if you look into every single law of the Old Testament, every single one of them is about your relationship with God or your relationship with other people. So, the ones that restrict you and say, don't do these specific things, it's about your relationship with God or it's about your relationship with other people. If you look at a law and it says you must do this thing, then that's either about your relationship with God or about your relationship with other people. Therefore, why does Jesus say, love the Lord your God? The second is like it, love your neighbor. On these two depend all of the law and prophets. Because it's a summarization of every single law in the Old Testament. And Jesus is saying, love is rooted in basing your life on God's revealed morality to this world. And so if you divorce yourself away from that, you are not opening the doors to be more inclusive where love is concerned. You are opening the doors to radical evil. You are opening the doors to chaos itself. You are opening the doors to every single thing being treated with subjectivity, to whatever someone wants to insert in there. And you say, no, you can't call that love. The just response will be, who are you? Who are you? What are you rooting that in? If you do not have a moral root for your definition of love, then you cannot limit it to anything. Without the law of God, it doesn't stop. Sinful man continues to devolve deeper in sin, as Romans 1 points out. Romans 1 warns us about this. It says, when you get your worship of God wrong, love God, you will then get your relationship with everyone else wrong. He says, you've exchanged your worship for God, and you've begun to worship things inside of creation. When you do that, you cascade deeper into sin in your life. Therefore, you ultimately end up man with man, woman with woman. And it says God will give you over to a reprobate mind, in which the judgment that you begin to experience in your life is you love those things instead of loving God. And there's no turning back. You just go deeper and deeper and deeper into sin with no way out. The slippery slope fallacy is not a fallacy. It is rooted in the Word of God. He warns us in Romans 1. Once you open the door to redefining God's standard of love, you will find that it does not shut. And things that you never assumed would get in are going to get in, to the point where we're talking about gender reassignment surgery for 5-year-olds now. Friends, it doesn't stop. It continues to go on further and further. Your affections will point your heart at something. And when you do not point your heart towards God, you can expect your affections to begin to become perverted. And you will fail to live up to that standard. And we have to bear some blame, even in heterosexuality, for some of this. This didn't start with gender confusion. It started with no-fault divorce. It started with our view that if your wife wakes up and she burns the bacon over and over again, you say, I can't live like this. Calling a lawyer. You laugh, but it happens. When we said marriage is not a serious matter, and if we cannot get through a conflict, we're just going to walk away from each other, that opened the door a little bit. Because marriage is defined and designed in God's law as being for one man and one woman for the entirety of your life. And when you walk away and break that covenant, there are societal ramifications to your sin, especially when you look at it and you don't just say, oh, that was bad. You look at it and you say, no, divorce is good. And you say, what if there are some divorced people are in here? They are. I know their names. I walked through their divorce with a few of them. You got to understand, without a doubt, every single person that I know in this church that is divorced, they didn't come out on the other side saying, man, that was a good time. I hope I get to do that again. No, it was the worst experience of their lives. They hated it. They don't want to go through that again. And they will look and they will say, something in me was painful in that process that I've never felt before, because I knew this is not how it was supposed to be. But I've got even worse news for you. You've blown it. None of you have lived up to God's standards of love. Not a single one of you. By God's grace, I've been married for 17 years. Man, I have had to say I'm sorry 1,000 times. That's probably an understatement of the year. It's probably been 5,000, 10,000 times. I remember one time when she had to say she was sorry to me. All right, there was that one time when she blew it and she had to apologize to me. So it's about 5,000 to 1 at this point. I'm lucky she's still around, okay? I was not good at marriage my first year of marriage. I needed an owner's manual quick. But by God's grace, I got some good counsel, looked at the Word of God, got some discipleship. I'm a little bit better, all right? I'm a little less selfish. But here's the reality, and I talked to you about this on Easter Sunday. You're all filthy sinners. Every sinner, the whole lot of you. You're a filthy sinner. You've blown it. I've blown it. I'm a filthy sinner. None of us can look at Jesus' statement. It says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. Love your neighbor as yourself. On this depend all of the law of prophets. None of us look at that and say, okay, I've done that. I'm good. No, you haven't. You've blown it. You've done something wrong. It doesn't matter if you're married right now. It doesn't matter if you're divorced. It doesn't matter if you're a widow. It doesn't matter if you're a widower. All of you have sinned in some way in love. Therefore, do we look at this and say, I can't meet that standard, so I need to invent a different one than I can live up to? Because that's the temptation. When you fail over and over and over, you then say, well, my subjective feelings and my subjective experience necessitates a lower bar. It necessitates a different measurement that I can live up to. No. How do I know that? Because Jesus, pointing backwards, is saying that was the standard and it still is, and it always will be. The standard is unchanging. So, are we just hopeless in a world to be consumed by sin, to fail over and over? I'm glad you asked. No, we're not. No, we're not. How do I know? Because of the words of Jesus. Look at what Jesus says in John 14:21, because we often miss something in this text. Jesus says, whoever has my commandments and keeps them, he it is who loves me. To which I say, I guess I don't love him. Because I've failed, I've sinned, I haven't done it. And he who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I will love him. If it stopped there, we wouldn't be able to live up to it. But we often miss because we don't understand how Jesus ends this verse. Look at what he says. And manifest myself to him. Those 4 words are the good news about the love of God in light of my sin. Since I've already failed, I can look at life and say, I don't love God, but then Jesus gives me a promise that at some point he's going to manifest himself to me. How? He's summarizing the gospel. Jesus is talking about the work that he was there to do. And so when Jesus is standing there with the scribes, with the Pharisees standing right there, and he says, on these depend all of the law and prophets. They're sunk, but so am I. But that wasn't the totality of Jesus' ministry. Just a few days later, Jesus would go to the cross. He had lived a perfect life. And Jesus is looking at them saying, I have loved God with all of my heart, with all of my mind, with all of my soul. I have loved my neighbor as myself. I have lived a life in perfect obedience to every single part of God's law. I'm the definition of love. I have done it, and I'm going to do it on the cross, where I'm going to die to pay the penalty for your inability to live up to the standard. So every moment of failure of love in your life went to the cross of Jesus Christ. He died, paid the penalty for that sin, rose from the dead to live again, to give you a new life with a new power in which you can seek to meet the standard of love. Here's what he says, 1 John, same apostle, 1 John 3, starting in verse 11. For this is the message that you have heard from the beginning, that we should love one another. There it is, it's the same thing. Verse 12, we should not be like Cain. And here's what you miss if you don't understand the Old Testament. We should not be like Cain, who was of the evil one and murdered his brother. And I love the fact that John asked this question. And why did he murder him? Why? Because his own deeds were evil and his brother's righteous. And that's a great descriptor for the failure to love God and love others. Cain offered a sacrifice to God. God would not accept Cain's sacrifice. Why? Because God knew Cain's heart. Cain did not love God. Abel offered a sacrifice to God. God accepted it. Why? Because Abel loved God, did what God commanded. And Cain, since he could not love God the way that God wanted him to love, he could not love others the way that God wanted him to love, so he killed his brother rather than repenting. But in Jesus Christ, we become able. We become the ones who can worship God. We become the ones who do possess the righteousness of God. Therefore, since I now know how to love God, what will I also know how to do? I will know how to love other people. But God warns us in 1 John, the apostle writes, starting in verse 13. He says, do not then be surprised, brothers, that the world hates you. We know that we have passed out from death into life because we love the brothers. Whoever does not love abides in death. He is summarizing the entire impact of the gospel on the life of someone that knows, I've failed to love God, I've failed to love other people, I fall at the mercy of God. What can be done for my sin? To which we are pointed to Jesus Christ. And once we are redeemed by the gospel of Jesus Christ, we can now love God. We can now love other people because we know how to love God. And the world looks at our love, and what does it say? Your love is too exclusive. Your love is bigoted. Your love is narrow. Your love is not inclusive enough. Those Christians do not love. Those Christians are hateful people. The very thing that John warns us about in 1 John 3. And they redefine love to become the anti-love. And what we know to be hate, sin, disobeying God, not loving God according to his standards, not loving other people according to their standards, we know that that is hate. We know that that will destroy them, to which we realize there is a conflict, and that conflict is a conflict between God and evil. And we endure through that. A sinful world will always hate what God calls righteous. A sinful world will even label as hate what God defines as love. And so when Jesus states in Matthew 22:37 that loving God is about heart, soul, and mind, he is telling us how far the transforming power of faith reaches into our lives to make right what sin has destroyed. He's saying, I'm not just saving part of you. He's saving every part of my being so that my heart, so that my soul, so that my mind, the totality of who I am can be pointed in true love to God. The resurrection gives us into the life of love, and God has defined love. He set it out in his law, and he has redeemed us from sinning against that standard and then given us the power to truly love as God loves. That's even why they use the language that they use. Jesus uses, there are four words for love in the original language here. The one that Jesus uses is the term agape. And that is translated as an enduring and committed love. It is the same love as the love that the Father has for the Son. In Deuteronomy 6:5, the Hebrew word that is used is the term aheb. That is a love that is an act of the will and mind determined for the welfare of others. Do you see how it narrows down by definition? It doesn't become something that's up for grabs. It becomes something that must be extremely pointed. So the love that God gives us then is the standard that we must define love by, and it is a standard that will not allow for anything to hurt the object of God's affection. And in this way, we realize that redefining love would do great harm. God's love is always better. So never accept a lesser standard of love than God's form of love. That's why parents, don't let just anyone date your children. Don't let some knucklehead who's defining love under selfish standards date your daughters or your sons. And you say, oh, they're my kids, I can't tell them what to do. Who told you that? That was rule 1 in the manual I got when I had kids. I tell them everything to do. So yes, you should limit and define love for your children. They are not smart enough. I've met some of them. You let them figure it out, good Lord, those doors are going wide open, all right? What happens next, because Jesus isn't done, is he goes further. Usually we stop at verse 40, but Jesus continues in a section that we often kind of ignore, but it's one that's refining the definition for Jesus even more. I want to start reading in verse 41. Now all the Pharisees were gathered together. Again, these guys cannot learn their lesson. They're strategizing again, but Jesus doesn't let them. Jesus asks them a question. Jesus looks back to them and asks them a question, saying, what do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he? And they said to him, he's the son of David. And Jesus responds, and he says, how is it then that David, in the Spirit, in the book of Psalms, calls the Christ Lord, saying, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet. If then David calls him Lord, how is he David's son? And no one was able to answer him a word, nor from that day forward did anyone dare to ask him any questions. They said, all right, you've outclassed us, we'll walk away. All right, you gave us a riddle we couldn't figure out. Jesus looks to the religious leaders, he looks to the experts in the law, he defines for them what love is. He says, you root it in the law of God. And then Jesus, in his question, actually looks to them and shows how far from God's definition of love they have fallen. Because he looks to them and he says, who is the Christ? Now, we know he's talking about himself. Jesus is the Christ. It's his last name. He's Mr. Christ. All right? I think some people actually think that. It's not a name, it's a title, okay? He didn't go around with his name. Mr. Christ. That's a title. It's from Messiah. and it means God's anointed one, okay? And so that's the title of Jesus. Jesus is saying, who is he? And they say, he's the son of David. And he is. He's the son of David. Everyone knew he would be the son of David. He would fulfill the Davidic covenant that's found in 2 Samuel. We'll get there in just a minute. But I want you to understand why what Jesus says right here is connected to the Great Commandment. Because number 3, he's saying you cannot know real love apart from Jesus. You can't do it. You will get it wrong every time. You will misdefine it. In John 15:9, Jesus makes the statement, as the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Abide in my love. This is vital to understand. Jesus is the source from which people know love. Therefore, if you do not know Jesus, you can't know what love is. The Pharisees kept coming to Jesus over and over to entrap him more and more. Then after confounding them by pointing out how they misunderstood the entirety of the law of God, and they didn't understand that it was through the prism of God's love, Jesus further turns the table on them here. In 2 Samuel chapter 7, God looks to King David, and he says through the prophet, my steadfast love will not depart from David, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away from before you, and your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. Therefore, he's looking to David and he's saying, your family, your lineage will rule over Israel forever. Do you know in Matthew 1, they look at the lineage of Jesus Christ. He came from the lineage of David. But in this, God reveals something more to these people because he asks, how will he be the son of David since David said he's going to be my Lord? Jesus is asking them the million-dollar question about who he is. In Jeremiah chapter 23, after the lordship and the kingdom of David had fallen, and it looks like Israel's completely hopeless, the prophet Jeremiah looks to Israel and he says, behold, the days are coming, declares God, Yahweh, when I will raise up for David a righteous branch. And so he's saying, no, the promise still stands. And he says, and he shall reign as king. He will deal wisely. He will execute justice and righteousness in the land. In his days, Judah will be saved and Israel will dwell securely. And this is the name by which he will be called. Capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. The Lord is our righteousness. So he's saying, kingdom of David will endure forever. And do you know who's going to come and fulfill it? God himself. Jesus looks to the lawyer and he looks to the Pharisees and he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. If you do that, you can love your neighbor as yourself. And you people are so blind that the one you're supposed to love is standing right in front of you. And you've missed it. You've missed it. You've missed it. The Lord is our righteousness. Jesus is looking at him saying, David says he's my Lord because it's God. Because Jesus is the Son of God who will rule and reign over his people. He will give love into my life so that I will have love to give to other people. Friend, won't you trust him? The greatest shame in the world is to go through your entire life misdefining love. The greatest shame would be going through your entire life undoing what God has already done. The greatest shame would be to miss the one who wants to give love directly into your life to transform you and every relationship to be that which God has meant it to be. Follow Jesus and know love. A few application points. Love is rooted in who God is. You will not find it anywhere else. Some of you will spend years trying, and it will quite literally destroy your life. Love is rooted in who God is. Root yourself down into him and you will always have it. Secondly, God has defined love in his law. Never believe anyone that says otherwise. Love demands an objective definition, and God has given it one in His law. Thirdly, to redefine love is hateful and wicked. That might be the most important for our society today. Do not put your children into a position where they have authority figures in their lives who are seeking to redefine love under a different definition than God has had. It will not end well. Because you're going to tell your children, respect your authority, but they're wrong. Don't do it. Don't do it. Anyone that seeks to redefine love is not to have any authority in your life or the lives of your children. Do not let them lie. It's a heinous evil. To redefine love is hateful and wicked. Fourthly, God redeems us to love with our whole being. He doesn't just save part of you. He wants all of you. So point all of you to Him. Fifthly, love the world by always pointing them to Jesus. When the world says no, you point back to Jesus. When the world says that's hate, you point them to Jesus. When the world says we refuse to accept it, you point them to Jesus. Root yourself in the gospel of Jesus Christ and refuse to move no matter the cost. Because He is God.